Hey guys, Spooky Little Fox here. Today I'll be making one of my favorite scenes from Little Nightmares. I'll be making this room from the Secrets of the Maw DLC. But before I start, here's a cute clip of me playing with the gnomes. First off, I wanted to make the furnace, that way I have a size reference for how big to make everything. I made these stencils, that way I know what shape to make everything in. I used an X-Acto knife to cut those shapes out of foam board. For any rough edges, I used an emery board to smooth them out. For the main part of the furnace, I took some pieces of foam board and glued them together like this. Then beveled the edges. I know it looks rough, but I smoothed it out after this. I then glued that foam board onto a piece of cardboard to give it some structure. I hot glued everything to the cardboard, but keep in mind if you're gonna hot glue foam board, make sure you have your glue gun set to low heat so it doesn't melt through. Now, I used this adhesive mirror for the part of the furnace that glows. I did this in hopes that it would reflect the light outwards and help make the glow stronger. To be honest, I was improvising with this. I'm still new when it comes to installing lighting on my pieces, so bear with me here. This hole will be where I feed the lights through. I used some fairy lights for this. These are great if you're new to installing lighting in your pieces. It does take a little strategizing beforehand, but you get better as you go. While I was working on installing the lights, I kept feeling tugging and looked down to see Morgana playing with them. I keep a bed for her under my desk because she loves being under there and snuggling with my feet while I work. She's such a cutie. Okay, for the lights, I hot glued them around the edges of the mirror like this. That way it's easier to diffuse the light. I'm aware of how messy this looks, but just trust the process. I promise I have no idea what I'm doing. I know there's a better way to do this, I just haven't found it yet. And after I burned the hell out of my fingers, I have this. Now to cover it up because no one wants to see that. Just kidding, you have to look at it for a little longer. I used this tool to add some rivets into the foam board. I also used a ball stylus tool to add some smaller rivets, being careful that I don't tear the foam board. I added this piece to the top where it's going to be connecting to the ceiling, that way it just looks more seamless. I then did a base coat of matte black acrylic paint, making sure to get it into every one of those rivets I added, as well as on the other parts of the furnace. Oh, I also made this hinge for the door off camera. After that, I painted everything gray, doing my best to avoid the rivets, but I gave up after a bit. That's okay though, I can just go in and add the details back. To make it look more like metal, I used some of this metallic acrylic paint. And just brushed that on everywhere. For the details, I mixed some of that same paint with black paint. I also watered it down a little bit to help it go into the cracks easier. This part was really satisfying to do. Just seeing how everything was coming together made me so happy. I glued some yellow and orange tissue paper to the door. This will help to diffuse the LED lights and create a soft glow. At least I'm hoping it will. Now, I did intend on gluing the door on this way, but I accidentally glued it on upside down. Whatever, it still looks good. Here's how it looks with the lights on. Pretty good for my first time doing lights like this. Next I'll be making the big pipes on the sides of the furnace. I used paper towel rolls for these, but they were a little too big, so I cut them down the middle, rolled them up a little tighter, and glued them using some Elmer's glue. I also used hot glue to hold everything in place while the other glue dries. Here you can see the difference in sizes. To make them look like this, I just cut them diagonally and hot glued them together like this. I didn't do this to all of them because I still need some straight ones. To cover up the seams, I used strips of paperboard. Then I painted them all black. I used the same metallic paint for these that I used for the furnace. To make the valve handles on the sides of the pipes, I used some aluminum crafting wire. I wrapped them around a pen that was the diameter that I wanted. and cut them to create these small circles. I then made some L-shaped pieces. I used hot glue to hold them in place while I added some super glue. Then I glued the circle of wire to those L pieces. If you're gonna do this though, be sure to have wax paper underneath, that way you don't accidentally glue it to your mat or something. I poked a hole in the straight pipes I made, that way I can put the valve handle in. Doing this will give it a much stronger hold. Then I painted everything using more metallic paint. Okay, now for the furniture on the right side of the room, specifically starting with the wood box on the bottom here. I cut 5 squares of balsa wood and glued them together like this. I then used some pieces of coffee stir sticks for the edges. I had some people comment that they wanted to see more of my creative process, so I decided to try it out. That's why this video is a bit longer than my others. I hope you guys don't mind. Alright, now I'll be making some of these dressers. For these I used some popsicle sticks and pieces of paperboard. First I cut the round edges off the popsicle sticks and etched some grooves into the paperboard. Doing this makes it fold a lot easier and with much cleaner lines. I cut them so I could fold them up like this. I didn't bother putting a back on it cause you won't see it anyways. The main reason I do it this way is to conserve on the amount of wood I use. Craft supplies can be pricey, so this is a nice trick to use if you're on a budget. For the drawers I used some balsa wood. I wanted to make the bottom drawer look like it's pulled out, so I glued some pieces of wood to it like this. And there we go, a nice little drawer. For the drawer handles, I took some of this large rustic chain I had and cut some of the links in half. Gosh, I need some new wire cutters, these things suck. But these were just a little too round, so I flattened them out using some pliers. Here's the difference after doing that. Then I glued them all on. I always make the mistake of gluing the handles on before I paint it, so don't be like me and paint before you glue them on. That way you don't have to paint around them. I used a similar technique for the rest of the dressers. You can also get creative with the details you add on. You can add more drawers or use different things for the hardware like beads and such. I used a much darker brown for this one to add some variation. I also remembered to paint it before adding the handles, yay! For these handles, I used some wood dowels that I glued together like this, and painted those with metallic paint. For this specific dresser, there's a sock hanging out of the open drawer, so to save time on sewing or anything, I cut the shape of the sock out of paperboard, painted it white, and then glued some fabric over it using hot glue. And the sock was looking a little too clean, so I dirtied it up using this off-white paint, and secured it onto the open drawer. Very nice. I was a little fancier with this dresser, as you can see. It's pretty easy if you just add some more popsicle sticks to the top and bottom to add more detail. I also added legs to this one to make it taller. I used the chain pieces for these handles as well. Next up is this crate in the back here with the stack of books. First, I cut this shape out of paperboard, etched lines in it to help it fold, then used wood glue to secure some pieces of popsicle sticks to the sides. I glued some tiny books and other trinkets into it. I didn't want to record myself making the books because I'm a little burnt out on making books after making the libraries. I still can't believe I made 555 books for it. Since it's too dark to see what this crate is sitting on, I made this thing with popsicle sticks really quick and stained it with watered down paint. Now I'll be making whatever piece of furniture the lantern is standing on. I just had to improvise for some of this stuff because it's so hard to see everything in game, and I kind of forgot to use the flashlight when I got my reference videos. I used the same technique for this dresser as the other ones. The only difference is I had to make a hole in the top to feed an LED light through for the lantern. I also used some beads for these handles. And of course I glued them on before painting again. Ugh, why am I like this? Now watch me work some magic with my newfound editing skills. Did you see that? That was crazy. Anyways, I filled this shelf with some miniature bottles and such I made from beads, and other tiny objects. Let me know if you guys want a tutorial on how I make these, by the way. I make all of my minis by hand. I also used scraps from other projects. Like here, I used some wallpaper from the janitor's room I made. Alright, there's a cute little trinket shelf. For the lantern, I used beads, buttons, some pieces of wire, and glued them together using super glue. I stole this LED light from one of those miniature kits you can get online. I felt bad doing it, but I think it was a worthy sacrifice. It took a while for me to figure out why the dang light kept flickering on me, but I realized that it was the wires making contact with the metal bead I used. I fixed it by covering the wire with a little tape. I'll be making the table on the side next. First, I cut a rectangle out of balsa wood. The corners were a bit too sharp, so I rounded them off using an emery board. Then for the bottom of the table, I glued some coffee stir sticks to add detail and to be an anchor for the legs when I glued them on. For the legs, I used some wooden dowels. And boom, we got ourselves a cute little table. I then painted it and weathered it off camera with a brown marker. Now I'll just be making some of the smaller details on the floor. I got these wooden blocks from the dollar store. They worked perfect for this piece, but they were a little too light colored, so I stained them with some watered down paint. For this little toy crate, I used some paperboard that I cut in this shape. I folded it like this and secured it with some glue, then slapped some wood on the sides, and stained it with some watered down paint. For the toy robot or whatever that's in the box, I glued together some beads like this. Then I glued in a bunch of tiny objects because you know how much I love adding clutter. I have a lot of fun doing it, and I think it makes things more interesting to look at. What do you think? Alright, here I'll be making this little bucket in the foreground. I used a strip of paperboard and glued it like this. For the bottom of the bucket, I used a stencil to draw 2 circles on another piece of paperboard, one inside of the other, making sure the inner circle is the same diameter as the bucket, and cut it out. It wasn't perfectly round, but that's okay. I cut some notches into it like this. You'll see why in a sec. Then etched some lines into the inner circle. I folded all of the edge pieces like this all around the inner circle. I inserted that piece into the bucket and pushed it down so it fit snug, and glued it in place with some Elmer's glue. Look how clean that turned out. Here I'm making the piece that the handle will be attached to. I poked a hole in that piece using a needle. For the bucket handle, I used some wire and bent the ends inward like this. This is how it will fit in there. Very nice. Now onto the painting. I did a base coat of gray all over the bucket to start with. It took way too long for me to realize that craft was spelled wrong. Carved wire, wow! Okay, so I used some of the carved wire to add a lip to the top of the bucket like this, and painted the whole thing with the metallic paint I used earlier for the furnace and such. At this point, it looks pretty good, but I think I can make it look better, so I decided to go in with these Gunpla weathering kits to make the bucket look rusty. First, using the brighter shade from the C palette, then going in with the darker rust shade from the B palette. I find that these palettes work a lot better if you add a tiny bit of water, just FYI. Now for the finishing touch. And there we go, cute little rusty bucket. I love how it turned out, and I'm glad I got some practice making something look rusty. Next up is the piles of clothes on the floor. For these, I cut some scraps of foam board and beveled the edges, and kinda glued them on top of each other haphazardly, just making the basic shape I wanted the pile to be. I made a bunch of these off camera too, some big ones and small ones. I slapped some Mod Podge all over them and put tissue paper on top of them. This was such a messy part. To make sure it was all secure, I put more Mod Podge on top of that. When it was dry, I painted it this gross off-white color. At this point, it was starting to resemble Resident Evil food, which is definitely not what I was going for, but just trust the process, please. I made this cutout for one of the wooden blocks I painted earlier. That way it looks like it's actually part of the pile. And to make it look less like Resident Evil food, I glued on a bunch of fabric scraps. I didn't really have a system with this part, I just glued them on at random. I did make these little pants though, that way you know it's clothes and not just a bunch of fabric glued together. I noticed there was some shoes in that pile as well, and since I didn't feel like hand making a bunch of shoes, I took a look through some of my trash, and it turned out I had one single doll shoe stashed in there. But the color's a little too bright, so let's fix that. I slapped some Mod Podge on there and glued some tissue paper on it. I don't know, I just feel like it makes it look more like a leather, plus it helps paint go on better than it would on plastic. When the Mod Podge was dry, I painted the shoe light brown on the outside and a darker shade on the inside. Alright, that looks good enough. Let's slap that on the pile too. add some more tiny beads and stuff to add variation. And there we go, a nice pile of clothes. And now for the furniture on the other side of the room. So, how long did it take you guys to notice the gnome's shadows in game? I'm sad to admit that I went through my entire first playthrough without noticing that little detail. It wasn't until my recent playthrough that I noticed them. If you don't know what I'm talking about, take a look at these. The gnomes have the shadows of children. Yeah, I teared up when I realized. This made me do a little digging as to why they are like that. And it turns out that at the end of Secrets of the Maw, it's revealed that the lady turned the runaway kid into a gnome. It's also highly likely that the runaway kid is the gnome that offers Six a sausage, and we all know how that went. So I'm assuming some of the children that attempted to escape met the same fate and are now gnomes left to live a life of fleeing and hiding with no foreseeable end. Some theories also suggest that the gnomes are enchanted by the lady to run the maw by feeding coal to the engines. You can see evidence to that here. These gnomes that you befriended want nothing to do with you upon seeing this furnace, and immediately get to work loading coal in to fuel the fire. The subtle storytelling in these games are really amazing and very dark. I'm having so much fun learning the lore about the Little Nightmares world, also known as the Nowhere. According to the Little Nightmares Wikipedia, the Nowhere is a physical world only accessible through dreams. And to travel to the Nowhere, you must reach the threshold, the space between the waking world and the Nowhere. Within the threshold resides a door with no doorknob that is guarded by the ferryman, and if he grants you permission, you may pass through. Only a special kind of tormented child is able to travel to the Nowhere with more ease and be guided by the ferryman. While some visitors are permitted to stay in the Nowhere for a short period of time before returning to their place of origin, others can remain trapped within the Nowhere for years. Any visitor that stays in the Nowhere for too long will begin to lose their memories of themselves and the people they knew. Within the Nowhere, there are a few locations we know of, such as the Maw that we see in the first Little Nightmares game, the Nest in Very Little Nightmares, the Pale City, which we see in Little Nightmares 2, and the Spiral, which is where Little Nightmares 3 will be taking place. I am so excited for this game. I love the circus theme. I feel like I could do something really cool with it. Reanimal also looks so good and creepy. I'm gonna have so much material for new art pieces. Speaking of new pieces, I just got Hollow Knight Silksong, and I've been absolutely blown away by it so far. Like, I literally cried because of how beautiful it is. It may have been why this video took so long to get posted. Sorry guys. I'm hoping to make a piece from that soon as well. Let me know if you guys would like to see something like that. Anyways, let me just speed run through making the rest of these details. For the main box, I kind of just glued together a bunch of cardboard to make a box that was the right size. Now, I would love to use wood boxes for my pieces, but I don't have any of the tools to do that for now, so I just gotta work with what I have. Alright, for the walls, I painted them matte black as a base coat, and glued a bunch of pieces of paperboard on there to act as metal panels or whatever. I also painted these black. And off camera I dry brushed it with a dark gray paint. For the floor I used some foam board. I etched some lines into it to make it look like stone slabs. Here's an up-close view so you can see what I did better. I painted it black and then used a ball of aluminum foil to add texture. I probably should have textured it before painting it, but whatever. Then I painted it gray, and I used a darker gray to bring out the details. If I accidentally used too much paint, I just used my finger to wipe it away. This actually worked out pretty well, and it made me want to try this with the whole thing. And so I did this. I put a little paint on and smeared it around with my finger to blend it in. I repeated this process for the whole floor, and I think it turned out pretty good. It's really amazing the things you can do with foam board. Off camera, I used some Mod Podge to seal it. Doing that actually made the floor shiny, which was great. We want it to reflect the glow from the furnace as much as possible. So the sides of the walls have these cracks in them that the gnomes and runaway kid can pass through. So to create the illusion of a hole there, I used some paperboard and cut the shape of the crack I wanted. To add detail to the left wall, I cut up a bunch of paperboard into squares and glued them on, making sure to leave the crack exposed. Now that that's done, I went in with some black paint to fill in some of the gaps. before I painted it dark gray. To add depth, I used a darker gray to line where the paperboard overlapped. For the wall on the right, I used the table as a height reference and drew the shape I wanted. Then I cut it out with an X-Acto knife. I did my best to paint it to look like a cracked stone wall. Then I glued them both in. I cut this slot in the back of the box, big enough to feed the battery pack for the lights through. Then went ahead and glued the furnace in. Now to start gluing everything else in. So for my next Little Nightmares piece, I'm planning on doing the twin chef's kitchen since so many of you have requested that I make it. I'm really looking forward to making all of the cute kitchen appliances and utensils. It's gonna be so much fun. As always, if you have any requests on what I should make, you can comment them below. Not only has reading your guys' comments inspired me, but it has also introduced me to some really good games. I've recently just played the game Outer Wilds because someone requested it on my TikTok. I'm not planning on making a piece from that. Do you ever wish that you could lose your memory just so you could play a game or watch a show for the first time again? Yeah, that's how I feel about Outer Wilds. Now, I won't spoil anything for those who haven't played it yet, but all I will say is that it is life-changing. And you should play it if you haven't. As much as I love making things from Little Nightmares, I would also love to branch out into making stuff from other games. There's a special place in my heart for indie games, so bonus points if you mention one of those. Of course, I'm not against making stuff from bigger games, but I just want to show some love to indie game devs. I feel like they're keeping gaming alive at this point. I mean, look at Hollow Knight Silksong. It literally crashed Steam and Nintendo Store with how many people who were downloading it. That is wild for such a small studio. I enjoy it so much when you can see the love poured into games in every little detail, or when you can really tell that they had fun making it. And I feel like that's something you don't really see with bigger games anymore. It's all about getting games out as fast as possible, which makes for some buggy or low-key boring games, as opposed to some independent games that have rich storylines, amazing art, and unique game mechanics that just exude the love that was poured into them. That's what I see with Silksong or Deltarune, Undertale, Animal Well, and many others that I can't list right now. Anyways, I just really love indie games. I don't know. Alright, now that everything's glued in, it's time to make the gnomes and Runaway Kid. I used original Sculpey for this. First I made this cone shape for their heads, and rolled out the clay like this for their arms and legs. For their body I made a little oval shape, making sure that it's smaller than the head, and put them together like this. Attach the arms and legs. You can put them in whatever pose you want. I wanted to make some sitting in different positions and standing. To make them sitting, you can attach the legs on like this. To make sure they could sit on their own, I posed them on a little wooden block, since you can put the blocks in the oven too. For one of the gnomes, I wanted to have it drawing a picture, so I made a pencil using a toothpick. The toothpick was a bit too long, so I cut it, and filed down the flat end with an emery board. Then I went ahead and painted it. Now I can give the gnome their pencil. Look how cute! I ended up making like 20 or more of these little guys to place in the scene. To paint them, I used gray acrylic paint for the base. While the gnomes were drying on my desk, my partner said it looked like they were all crucified, and yes, it definitely looks like it. Anyways, after they were done being crucified, drying, I used a wash on their bodies to make the color look less flat. I also used the same wash to add some detail to their heads. Then went over those a little with some black paint. For the Runaway Kid, I made a wire skeleton for him using some tiny jewelry wire, and sculpted his body on top of that. I didn't record this part because it was a lot of work to make him and I really had to focus, but this is what he looks like. For the little link of chain on his ankle, I just used some jewelry chain and just looped it on there. I went ahead and painted him with acrylic paint. I know this color is a bit bright, but I'll fix that in a second. For his hair, I did a base coat of black, and then went in with a light brown over that. To tone down that blue, I used the same wash that I used for the gnomes. And here we go, he's all finished. Now to place them all on the scene. Remember how I tried to make the gnomes sit on their own? Well, that didn't work. Whoops, sorry, buddy. To remedy that, I put just a little bit of Elmer's glue on their butts, and it was able to hold them in place enough. I usually like to be able to move around my minis, so I don't glue them down immediately, but these little guys kind of needed it. You could probably use super glue for this, but be warned, it's pretty messy, and you also run the risk of gluing it somewhere you don't want it. I cannot tell you how many times I have accidentally glued miniatures to my fingers. For example, the runaway kid's hands. I think I accidentally glued them to my fingers like 5 times while I was working on him, hence my not recording it. It's a messy job making miniatures sometimes. Also, I know my gnome placements are not accurate to the game. I was just having so much fun hiding them or making them do different things. Oh my god, look, they're holding hands! I wanted to add a little more life to the scene, so I made them do different things. Like, I made this one reading a book, and of course I made the one drawing pictures. For these tiny pictures, I used paper scraps and doodled on them with a micron pen. I don't know, it looks like something a gnome would draw, right? Look at them, they're such a cutie. And now for a very important detail, the children's shadows. Since it's obviously impossible for me to change their actual shadows, I decided to paint them on. This actually turned out way better than I expected. I was really nervous about doing this, because if it turned out bad, I don't know how I would have gotten the paint off the fabric and stuff. Yeah, I was worried. But I'm happy it turned out good. Alright, now it's time for some glam shots. I think the reason I love this scene is because this is what could be considered a safe room. I think safe rooms are one of my favorite things about scary games. After fighting your way through a hostile world, then to be met by warm lighting and soothing music, I don't know, it's definitely impactful. My favorite safe rooms in video games are in the Resident Evil series, specifically Resident Evil 4. You just can't beat that music. I actually have it as my alarm tone to wake up in the morning. That's how much I love it. What are some of your favorite safe rooms in video games? Thank you so much for watching my video. If you want to support me further, you can support me over on Patreon. I also got my memberships set up, so if you want to join that, you're totally welcome to do so. I also started my own Discord server that you can access through memberships or Patreon. If you subscribe to my Patreon or memberships, you can have your name on Spooky's little card in this animation here at the end of each of my videos. Any support is appreciated, even just interacting with my video or subscribing. I appreciate it all. Alright, bye!